I'm Senator Dick Black, and I'm pleased to join you for this important conference. Now, my remarks will focus on Mideast conflict and America's undeclared war against the Syrian people. Our current actions against Syria are unlawful, and they run counter to our vital national interest. More importantly, they represent a direct pathway to a much larger and far more dangerous and unpredictable war against Iran and its neighbors. Syria is the center of gravity in the war on terror. In other words, its survival as a viable, intact state may very well determine the outcome of the global war on terror. Should Americans succeed in our long-held objective of toppling the Syrian government, this would lead to an unprecedented expansion of jihadist terror. Within months, Lebanon and Jordan would fall. And this would likely embolden President Erdogan, the Turkish dictator, to drive hordes of battle-hardened jihadists fresh from the battlefield to overrun the nations of Europe. For this reason, America's dogged opposition to the Syrian nation-state poses a clear and present danger to Europe and to all of civilization. Now, let me be clear, I'm not speaking as a pacifist. I served in uniform 32 years. I was wounded fighting as a forward air controller in the 1st Marine Regiment. And I made 70 combat patrols, generally at night, deep behind enemy lines. I was wounded during an attack, and both of my radio men died fighting beside me. Before that, I flew 269 combat missions as a helicopter pilot. My aircraft was hit by enemy ground fire on 4 missions. Eventually, I served as a division chief in the Office of the Judge Advocate General at the Pentagon. There, I prepared executive orders for the President's signature, testified before Congress on behalf of the U.S. Army. So I guess I say this to let you know that I love my country. I've bled for it. And I respect the men and women who obey the orders that they're given when we send them over to war, even though I often think those orders are extraordinarily ill-advised. I'm deeply concerned by the direction of American foreign policy, particularly as it affects Syria, because that nation is a vital gateway to Turkey and thus on to Europe itself. Now, before the Syrian war began in 2011, Syria was one of the 5 safest nations on earth. It had the greatest women's rights and the greatest religious freedom of any of the Arab nations. It was debt-free. It produced its own energy, food, many of its own manufactured products. Its economy was very well balanced, and it was self-sufficient. Syria had been at peace with Israel for 40 years. In 2013, just to demonstrate the secularization of the government, Syria erected one of the world's greatest statues of Jesus Christ, and it towers over Israel, Lebanon, and Syria. Syria is a diverse and secular country. It's home to about 2 million Christians and 2 million Alawites. Now, the Alawites are a very highly modernized population. Additionally, they have Druze and large Sunni and smaller Shia populations of Muslims. The great majority of each religious group have supported the central government. The Grand Mufti, Ahmad Hassoun, is the spiritual leader of Syria's Sunni Muslims. Ahmad is an unwavering supporter of Syria's President Bashar al-Assad. During the 7 brutal years of the war, the Syrian nation of about 23 million has united and withstood the combined forces of 2/3 of the world's military and industrial might. But despite this massive international pressure, there's not been a single assassination attempt against President Assad, who enjoys overwhelming and passionate support of the army and the people. Syria has faced the combined might of Americans, British, French, Israelis, Turks, Qataris, and Saudi Arabians. By any reasonable definition, the United States is at war with Syria. Since 2012, the United States has operated terrorist training camps in Jordan, Turkey, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and now inside Syria itself. We have supplied terrorists with tens of billions of dollars worth of arms, ammunition, training, and payroll. This was done under the CIA's classified program, Timber Sycamore. Now, once that program was disclosed, it was quickly terminated, but American financed weapons, training, and manpower still flow freely to terrorists under other covert programs. Despite this lengthy war of aggression, not a single terrorist has ever become a popular figure among the Syrian people. They remain doggedly loyal to President Assad and the Syrian armed forces. Now recall that it was al-Qaeda that hijacked airliners and flew them into the Twin Towers and the Pentagon on September 11, 2001, killing 3,000 Americans. Nonetheless, throughout the Syrian war, the U.S. has aligned with al-Qaeda and its affiliate against Syria. Virtually every so-called moderate rebel group has, at one time or another, fought shoulder to shoulder with al-Qaeda or ISIS. The dominant jihadists are sworn to behead all Christian and Alawite men and to make sex slaves of their wives, their daughters, and their children. For this reason, the success of the American venture in Syria could very well trigger one of the greatest genocides in recent history. Common to Western propaganda, the war was never a popular uprising. President Assad did not take harsh measures against early demonstrators. In fact, he issued orders requiring riot control troops to carry wooden batons instead of rifles. As a consequence, many died at the hands of al-Qaeda and the Muslim Brotherhood before he finally relented and permitted them to protect themselves with loaded weapons. Now let me address the often cited claim that Assad has used poison gas, crossing some red line. That claim is patently false. The same propaganda ploy was used first by the CIA as a pretext to launch the invasion of Iraq. That deceit proved so successful in laying the groundwork for the Iraq War that it has been used several times during the conflict in Syria to blame President Assad for gassing his own civilians. This lie has duped Americans into being drawn ever deeper into the Syrian war. But ask yourself this question. If Syria wanted to use poison gas, why would they use it on toddlers and their parents instead of using it to defend against ISIS and al-Qaeda in the desperate battles raging across the country? Now, poison gas is not used in pinprick attacks against civilian targets. If it is used, it's employed massively in conjunction with large-scale offensive maneuvers on the battlefield. Each of the 3 false flag attacks staged by al-Qaeda and its allies was convincingly disproven by the world's most respected investigative journalist, Pulitzer Prize-winning reporter Seymour Hersh, the man who broke the stories of the My Lai massacre in Vietnam and the Abu Ghraib prison misconduct in Iraq. He has greater access to the inner workings of the CIA and the Pentagon than any other journalist today. It would be totally irrational for President Assad to employ poison gas given the predictable backlash and the total absence of any military benefit to Syria. The U.S. has long planned regime change in Syria. According to General Wesley Clark, the former Supreme Allied Commander of Europe, America first began drafting war plans to topple Syria in 2001. WikiLeaks published actual secret plans that were developed by the U.S. Embassy in Damascus in 2006. Those plans laid out detailed steps to destabilize and topple the legitimate government of Syria. In 2010, Hillary Clinton became Secretary of State. She executed plans to overthrow Libya, to capture its arsenal of weapons, and to use them to arm terrorists in Syria. When Libya's leader, Colonel Muammar Gaddafi, was murdered in 2011, we invaded Libya under the guise of a no-fly zone. We quickly gave the Turks control of a Libyan airfield and then began flying plundered Libyan weapons into Turkey using Qatari aircraft. The first aircraft that was sent from Libya also carried 700 Tunisian terrorists who were sent across the Turkish border and into Syria. From 2011 until today, the U.S. has fought to topple the popularly elected government of President Bashar al-Assad and install a puppet regime. But why are we fighting in Syria at all? In fact, what are we fighting for anywhere in the Middle East? Our own actions have spawned huge armies of ISIS and al-Qaeda terrorists. Without us there, both Iraq and Syria would soon eliminate the last vestiges of these terror groups and restore order to their own nations. So, are we fighting to serve U.S. or foreign interests? And are we simply deploying courageous American troops as a sort of foreign legion for hire? Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, the brutal dictator of Saudi Arabia, was overheard saying, "I have Kushner in my pocket." Some believe that Jared Kushner, who had access to presidential intelligence, may have revealed the names of Saudis who were disloyal to the Crown Prince shortly before the Saudi dictator launched his brutal crackdown on those same dissidents. Is this all being done for personal gain? Now, certainly, war profiteers have amassed enormous fortunes through these wars. And we know that our coalition partners, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, want to topple Syria to force them to run lucrative oil and gas pipelines across Syria's sovereign territory. But you know, I am amazed at Americans' acquiescence in perpetual Mideast war. No one even mentions an end to hostilities and a return to peace. By contrast, it's instructive to recall that we only fought in World War I for 17 months before politicians were forced to promise that that would be the war to end all wars. Now think of this. After 17 years, we remain committed to several simultaneous wars with no end in sight. It's breaking our military forces down, and it's bankrupting the nation. How many Americans realize that fully 1/3 of the entire U.S. national debt has been incurred through our Middle Eastern wars? Despite the U.S. lives lost, soldiers maimed, and treasure wasted, despite 1.5 million Libyans, Afghans, Yemenis, Iraqis, and Syrians killed, despite trillions in property destruction, I cannot point to a single thing that these wars have done for the American people or for the vital national interests of the United States. Instead, we've generated massive streams of refugees who are hostile to Western values and determined to undermine European cultures. We started these wars facing a small contingent of terrorists. Well, here we are a generation later. We've multiplied their ranks 1,000-fold by arming, training, and financing these same terrorists. We've given them real-world battlefield experience, making them the most combat-ready forces on Earth today. This, in my view, is suicidal madness. The enormous fear and resentment we've generated have obliterated generations of goodwill. This makes it a near certainty that China will soon displace, through peaceful means, the trade and influence the U.S. has tried to exact through fear and terror. Unless the U.S. develops a strategy for peace, China will displace us as the world's dominant power. Our present strategy amounts to regime change by raining down bombs, collapsing homes, blowing bodies into the streets. By contrast, China quietly builds highways, factories, dams, infrastructure, without instigating violent coups. Now, which approach will appeal to foreign nations? Given the choice, they will inevitably opt for China's roads, bridges, dams, and factories over the American bombs, destruction, and bloodshed. Just take a look at Iraq. From 1990, when the Gulf War first began, until today, the U.S. bombed that country almost incessantly. During the 28-year bombing campaign, we've dropped over 1,000 or over a third million bombs on Iraq. And the number's still rising. Just this past week, we, or our ally Israel, bombed Iraq's Popular Mobilization Forces, killing 22 and wounding 12. At that time, those Iraqis were fighting ISIS, our supposed enemy. So this week's attack rounds out the 28th year of hostile actions on Iraqi territory against a nation that, just like Syria, has never once taken hostile action against the United States. Now, returning to Syria, the U.S., which once promised no boots on the ground, is likely to have as many as 8,000 soldiers, Marines, and contractors stationed in Syria today. We've built at least 11 bases in northeast Syria, a fact that Turkey disclosed in 2017 to our enormous consternation. U.S. troops are presently embarked on a mission to carve out a tenuous, landlocked state by granting the Kurdish minority dominance over predominantly Arab lands in northeast Syria. This region, lying between the Euphrates River and the Turkish border, comprises about 30% of Syria's landmass. Now, while it's sparsely populated, it holds much of the oil, gas, and agricultural wealth that sustains the entire Syrian people. Should this American Plan B succeed in splitting Syria apart, the nation's people will be permanently impoverished. All of this so the U.S. can block ancient trade routes linking Syria, Iraq, and Iran. This appears to be part of a strategy to pave the groundwork for a far greater war yet to come. But there is great hope in Syria. The Syrian armed forces and its allies have liberated 90% of Syria's population. Since Russia intervened in 2015, Syria has scored an unbroken string of battlefield victories. Almost all of its major cities have been liberated by the Syrian army. It's only the resistance of the United States, Israel, Turkey that prevent a rapid conclusion to the war. It's high time for the United States to depart from Syria and to leave the Middle East. If we leave, there'll be a time of peace and reconciliation. Refugees will return and rebuilding will accelerate. Now, since its liberation by Syrian forces in December of 2016, almost 500,000 Syrians have already returned back to the second largest city of Syria, which is Aleppo. The United States could make an impressive humanitarian gesture simply by lifting its naval blockade of Syria and by releasing the monetary restrictions in order to end the starvation, the poverty, the deprivation from medical supplies that we have inflicted on their people. Americans are a good and decent people. Our nation is better than our foreign policy would suggest. We need to stop inflicting violence by supporting terrorist groups and restore peace to the world. Thank you very much.